will follow up on the question that Angelina has raised. What can be done by looking at the Russian case? I will analyze the current changes, or rather modifications of... Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I will analyze the current changes and modifications of the Russian mode of development that I would describe as extractivist. Extractivism is nothing new in human history, right? So there has always been the extraction of resources, and there most likely will always be extraction of resources, as it is a precondition for social reproduction. But under capitalist conditions, extractivist economies or extractivist mode of development are specific, in a sense that resource extraction is usually geared towards exports, towards the need of the world market that really fuels the extraction in resource-rich countries. Moreover, this usually goes along with a peripheral position of extractivist countries in the international division of labor. So we are talking about a hierarchic system of in the international division of labor, as the extraction is usually not accompanied by the refinement of resource and also the industrial process, which is a precondition for technological development. So we have a strong division and hierarchical division in the world. Moreover, as the Argentinian sociologist Maricela Swampa would argue, extractivist development is, or inherent to extractivist development, is the need to expand to new uncolonized territories, right? Just to give you an example, since the 1970s, global resource consumption has more than tripled. So there is always a constant need to increase the territory, or to expand the territory where resources are extracted, and most likely up to 2050, the global resource consumption will triple again. So the urgent need to increase resource extraction is very closely connected to the growth paradigm enshrined in the capitalist mode of production. Why is this important, and what am I kind of aiming at? The climate crisis is very closely connected to the extractivist mode of development. And I think what is unique about the climate crisis is that it is the first and so far only crisis that gives humankind a very limited amount of time to act, right? We have about 20 to 30 years left to at least diminish the most hazardous and most dangerous outcomes, which is a totally new situation. There has never been a crisis like that before. There has been, of course, economic crisis. There still is the threat of a nuclear confrontation, but it does not have this limited time frame, right? Which makes it very special and very difficult to act, and which is also probably one of the answers why is it actually so difficult to act coordinately, even though everyone on this planet will be affected. Not equally, but everyone will be. So if we are looking at the camps, trying to map the kind of political camps, how they position themselves with regard to the climate crisis, I would most broadly say that there are about three camps. So on the one hand, you have the ecological modernizers who would believe that by technological advancement, by the decarbonization of our economies, we will be able to advance to something that would be called green capitalism, which would allow a new technological development, which would allow new economic growth, which is the base for capitalist development. And on the other hand, there are the defenders of the status quo, very often climate deniers, but also that could also be seen in Germany, for example, in the debate on not advancing electrification of the car industry, right? But keeping fossil fuels as the bottom line for the German car industry and the engine, of course. And then there at the third camp, so to say, would be those who would advance a socio-ecological transformation that would go beyond a capitalist modernization, but rather a really new form of climate and economic governance. With regard to Russia, we can see all these three camps, and we can see very different and pronounced changes. Just 4 days ago, on October 7th, the Federation Council of the Russian Federation held parliamentary hearings on the draft of the federal budget for the next year. And there was an interesting comment by Nikita Anisimov, who is currently the rector of the National Research University Higher School of Economics. And he said, I quote, "As a result, today, thanks largely to the situation of external shocks and the rapid restructuring of our economic structure, we have been able to significantly reduce our dependence on raw material exports. Thus, we can say that the sanctions have only made our economy stronger and more stable." End of quote. If we look at the economic figures, it's a very bold statement by Anisimov. There has been a drop in exports, that is right, especially in gas, which is mostly due to the loss of European customers, because most of Russian gas was exported to the European Union. But according to the Russian Federal State Statistics Service in 2022, about 60% of exports were composed of fossil fuels, so oil, gas, and coal. And this does not take into account the additional 15% of other resources such as grain, metals, and gemstones. So, this being said, Russia is very much dependent on its resources. Moreover, revenues from oil and gas export finance the state budget by at least 20 to 30%. So it's very crucial to think about, alternatives for resource extractivism, because, most of the state budget, pensions, the welfare system, hospitals are financed thanks to the export of oil and gas. So it's really the question of how to move beyond and what to propose a country that is so heavily dependent on export, and Russia even has quite an advanced industry, right? But there are a lot of countries that even depend mostly on one single export or one single resource in order to finance their state budget. So this just shall give you the complexity of how difficult it is to move beyond an extractive mode of development, and mostly this cannot be done individually by a single country, but is actually a common question of global governance. So this allows two conclusions to draw. Russia is highly dependent on the export of raw materials, but secondly, the raw material export is geared towards the need of fossil capitalism. So Russia has really adapted to fossil capitalism and has really a central position here, being one of the biggest exporter of oil and gas in the world. So this gives Russia also a considerable degree of political and economic influence, but also a considerable degree of influence in the climate negotiations that Angelina has mentioned before. So a solution to the climate crisis, or at least adapting to the climate crisis globally, can only include Russia. And this is also maybe not a direct answer to your question, can we actually work with autocratic regimes or not? But given the limited amount of time, I would say there's no other alternative than working with everyone. What is interesting now is that we can observe decarbonization strategies in the EU, in China, and in the US and Japan as a response to the climate crisis. And this immediately threatens the fossilist, capitalist, extractivist mode of development in Russia and other countries. And it really raises the question, what kind of economic model Russia would like to pursue in the future? And while the effects of extractivist development in the context of energy transition in the global south are increasingly becoming a subject of scientific research, similar developments in Russia have so far gone largely unnoticed. And therefore, I would like to outline now new regimes of environmental and economic governance that I would observe now in Russia and that are kind of being debated and fought and contested, socially contested within the Russian society right now. The first one I would call reindustrialization efforts in the wake of military Keynesianism. The second one is a modernized green extractivism, and the third one is an intensified brown fossil extractivism. I would like to say that these development models I outline here, they are ideal-typical, so they do not necessarily, can be translated into reality just like that. They will most likely emerge as, as kind of a fusion, and they do not necessarily contradict each other as they might seem contradictory at on the first glance. And so I would say it's very likely that something like a modified development model, modified extractivism, is going to emerge. If we're talking about reindustrialization efforts, I would like to come back to Anisimov, who says that resource dependence has decreased in Russia. And in effect, as a matter of fact, he's right. Russia is currently experiencing an industrial revival. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, there have been repeated predictions of Russian economic collapse, especially due to the Western sanctions. But in order to stabilize economic development, and also in response to the military defeats in Ukraine by the summer of 2022, the Russian government has implemented a change in strategy, which is known as military or war Keynesianism. Military Keynesianism describes a state-led macroeconomic policy that aims to increase aggregate demand by increasing military spending. So in other words, the state invests heavily in industrial production, especially in arms production, as it is needed in order to win the war. And the state demand is causing a very strong economic an upheaval in industrial production. And this cannot only be reduced to arms production, but also to suppliers, right? Steel industry, for example, chemical industry that are very important to supply arms industry. They are also kind of recovering very strongly after almost 30 years of depression after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the capitalist transformation in Russia. In 2023, gross domestic product grew by 3.6%, and even in this year, a growth between 2.5% and 3% is expected. And what is also interesting is that there is a strong wage increase in the industry, especially in the arms industry. And this is a very new situation compared to the 20, 30 years before. And to a certain extent, it also creates kind of favorable conditions for the political environment right now, right? This does not mean that people necessarily support the war in Ukraine, but their economic and social situation is increasingly better than it used to be 4, 5, 10 years before. So I think this also really should make us think about how economic governance can really determine political situation, stability, and crisis in a certain country, even if it's very destructive, for example, fostering arms industry. I would argue that military Keynesianism should not be reduced to a mere economic policy in times of war. It is rather a long-term political strategy that is put forward in particular by national conservative factions in Russia, which are very much organized in the state, but also in civil society via think tanks, etc. And these particular factions would argue that the country's strong dependence on raw material export is a threat to national security. So it's not really a progressive debate on climate change, right? But the danger of Russia being under pressure or in conflict with other nations makes us or forces the country to increase industrial production in order to become independent and not dependent on foreign technology. This is the way how the discourse is presented usually. And this goes along with also a different, with the focus on the domestic market. So we need to develop our own market. We need also to increase wages so people can actually buy the products that are produced within Russia, which is a very definitely a break to the very neoliberal tradition that was predominant before. And there is also a new geopolitical orientation, which is more focused on the post-Soviet space, especially the Eurasian Economic Union and China. So whereas before, especially the European Union and especially Germany were very important economic partners, this has changed over the years now. There is, like I've said before, there is support for this form of economic policy, this military Keynesianism, among workers that are working in these specific industries, among this national conservative part of society, but also among the industry, the managers that are, leading defense industry, chemical industry, machine building, that are connected to this kind of development model. And I think this is also a new development, that we have a very broad societal consensus, or at least a coalition fostering and propagating this kind of policy. So I would even argue that there are political forces and factions of capital which are rather domestically oriented and peripheral in the international division of labor, which have an interest in the conflict in Ukraine, but also in the increasing conflict with the West, as it allows them to advance their economic agenda. And I think this is also kind of maybe a reason for this change of strategy. The second kind of development model that I would like to outline today is a modernized green extractivism, which is a reaction, or rather a response to ecological modernization strategies in the EU, USA, and China. The aim of decarbonization of the economies in these countries threatens to usher in a new global raw material supercycle. So whereas in the past, the focus was primarily on fossil fuels, precious and industrial metals, the focus is now on raw materials that are going to drive a green, electrified, high-tech economy. For example, rare earths, right? Lithium, for example, for the car industry. And this new phase of this could, enact a new phase of accumulation through the expropriation of raw materials and lands in resource-rich countries, and also in Russia. And in the literature, this is characterized as green extractivism, which is just like other form of extractive development, characterized by the exploitation of raw materials for the world market, but this is also specific because the concept of green extractivism criticizes the exploitation and capitalist appropriation of raw materials, natural properties, for example, solar radiation or wind, and labor for the purpose of the green technological energy transition. So contrary to what the adjective green might suggest, this is not an environmentally friendly and socially just valorization of nature, but it is rather the focus on the reconstruction of the economy, the energy, and the transport sector as a part of a green economy. I think this is something that we should differentiate here. And of course, we can also see structural relations of inequality and exploitation within a green extractivist mode of development. Again, how this might manifest in the Russian context, I would say that especially that in the Russian context, the focus is very much on the production of green energy, especially hydrogen. And here the country would modernize its exports, its exports, its energy exports especially. So Russia would adapt to the ecological modernization strategies put forward by the EU and China by supplying green hydrogen and remain a strong position in the energy sector, although the power relations that shape the Russian society today pretty much remain intact, because big energy companies that are active now in fossil fuels will be most likely the ones who produce hydrogen in the future, because they are the ones who have the capital to invest in these very capital-intensive energy production processes. In a way, the extractive logic is also reproduced as the production of clean energy is mainly intended for export. For example, Russian companies are advertising their intention to export hydrogen in the future, but to store the resulting CO2 emissions in the country. So right now, it's still very difficult to produce green hydrogen, and usually there are different forms. For example, you can produce hydrogen on the base of fossil fuels or nuclear energy, and the CO2 emissions that are produced will be captured in Russia and stored by certain technologies and exported to a foreign country, for example, the EU or China, which will allow a decarbonized economy in the West, for example, in the EU, while Russia has to bear all the ecological consequences. So again, we see an ecological uneven development. Moreover, something similar can be observed in the construction of nuclear power plants. The nuclear corporation Rosatom not only builds and operates nuclear power plants, but also supplies them with enriched uranium and imports depleted fuel rods for reprocessing. So lower ecological regulations increase global competitiveness in resource extractive countries. So the deregulation of ecological standards is actually needed or more or less enforced on resource extractive countries in order to be competitive on the global market. And this deregulation of ecological standards, of course, has immediate effects on the population that lives in the country. Finally, I would just like to outline shortly an intensified brown fossil extractivism, which most likely would focus on the Arctic region, which again, due to climate change, becomes accessible. The permanent ice is retreating, so it's actually easier to exploit resources in the Arctic. So again, this would increase exploitation of new fossil deposits. But I would believe that this intensified brown extractivism is not a model for the future, because important export markets for the Russian economy, and especially China and the European Union, are very much advancing the decarbonization of the industry. So it is very likely that Russian extractivism will adapt into some sort to the developments that are taking place now. Coming to a conclusion, what I'm trying to show today is that neither strategy that I would observe in Russia is really an answer to the climate crisis, and actually intensifies the climate crisis in various ways. Military Keynesianism is not an economic model that would adapt to the needs of climate change, right? Reindustrialization of the country would actually increase various problems, and it's because it is not a sustainable model of production, and it fosters the arms industry, which is very much capable of, fostering, which is very prone to new conflicts. So this is a very controversial development, but also, as I have pointed out, a modernized green extractivism has a lot of contradictions in itself. So I would say that global inequality and uneven development, as we analyze them currently, as we understand them right now, must be expanded and include new analytical categories. So in the context of the climate crisis, we observe an increasing divided planet between industrialized, developed, rich, and decarbonized green centers and resource-extracting peripheries, where the trade in waste from resource-intensive lifestyle is increasingly becoming a business model. Thank you very much.
I have several questions. First, how do you estimate the impact of the Russian war in Ukraine onto climate change? Second, what does it mean that the economic situation in Russia has improved during the war? For instance, a full half of the Russian treasury has been arrested by the Western countries, $300 billion. This is a big part of what Russia saved, and through the decades of oil and gas exports. So half of all this treasury has been gone, and will probably be used next for paying reparations or military aid to Ukraine. And so it's a kind of more theoretical question. Does it make any sense to talk about center and periphery in the contemporary oil-dependent world, in which the richest countries of the world actually are petrostates, Saudi Arabia and the pre-war Russian Federation and many other such countries? Are they peripheries, or they are new financial centers of the modern capitalism?
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I guess my question is a little connected to the previous question. You mentioned the changing geopolitical orientation, and I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that, especially Russia's role and connection to the petrodollar system and the new initiatives in the BRICS sector of de-dollarization, and how do you see the impact of this kind of developments on US, Germany, and the rivalries between the capital of petro capital?
Yeah, I remember mine. I think both your talk and Angelina's is haunted by a certain specter of redistribution. Like when we talk about global inequality and uneven and combined development and global division of labor and how it's all contribute to polycrisis, we of course kind of think about how to make everything just, and but in the case of redistribution, I wonder Keynesianism in the past was kind of was a model that allowed a lot of social wealth to get redistributed between different classes, social class, especially like the working class. And I don't think that in Russia, like something happens in the military sector, but not in the, for the population overall. And of course, and the question is like, even if whether we can, how to say, like if we put the same model on non-military basis, can it be extracted? Can it allow for something like Green New Deal to emerge, like that might actually contribute to the redistribution of wealth and climate justice? So might there be a certain alignment of models that are proposed in the West and in Russia that might be not provide like an ultimate answer to the climate crisis, but at least point towards a direction where like two power blocks can at least in the confrontation point to something new, like to reconstitution of the sort. Yeah.
I start with the question on the impact of the war, of the ecological impact of the war in Ukraine. I think actually Angelina is the better person to answer that question, as she's working in a project that analyzes exactly these kind of questions. But I could say that the war in Ukraine is probably the first war that where from the beginning the ecological impact is very closely analyzed. That's I think a very special aspect of this war, and the impact of the war on ecology is disastrous. Just to give you the example of the destruction of the dam in Kakhovka, right, which is a catastrophe in itself. But I mean, constant shelling, constant bombing, the destruction of social infrastructure, housing, energy. Of course, this is disastrous for the ecology, and especially arms production is another factor that has extremely negative consequences for the environment, because we use scarce resources to produce something that for destruction and killing, right? So in the best case, these arms are not going to be used. They will just be stored somewhere. But Germany has announced to spend 100 billion euros on arms race, right, on arms production. So in the best case, all these tanks and rockets that will be bought will just be used, just for exercises. But in the case of actual warfare, they are meant for destruction. So this is an extremely destructive industry, and of course the impacts are disastrous. If I have said that the economy has improved, then I have to apologize. I meant to say that the economy is growing in Russia, despite the fact that it was predicted that it will fall into a crisis, and this hasn't happened, astonishingly. And one reason why this hasn't happened is military Keynesianism. And military Keynesianism is an answer, at least a short-term answer to these problems. I'm not saying that this is a long-term answer, and neither is it sustainable, right? But it is a change in policy in Russia, and it might change really in the future the development as it has very significant changes in the country. It is supported by a broad alliance in the society, starting of workers, politicians, and capital factions. It is, it is a change in strategy, as to a certain extent it has improved the situation of a certain amount of people who are living in this sector, who are working in these sectors, who have higher wages, who can buy more than they used to have, than they could before. And it is also connected to a certain geopolitical alignment. So I would say there could, if the situation will continue in the future, it could emerge something new, right? This was my point. Not that it is that the economy has improved, especially not for everyone. Of course, I would even say the polarization in Russian society has increased even more, because of course there is the downside, and there are people who do not profit from the war at all, right? So this should be said too. Center and periphery. I would say that these categories are very telling, and they can be applied to uneven development very much as because the way how our world is organized, especially economically and politically, is hierarchical. And if you say that the richest countries are the oil, in Arab oil states, that might be true, but the complexity of their economy is very low, right? And something that really determines economic and industrialized success and power is the way how complex an economy is structured. So the center economies in the EU, the US, and increasingly China, they are able to produce a variety of very complex products that are, and they always need constant technological research, which is not needed in a resource extractive economy, where once you put all once you start extracting, this whole process will continue without new research, without educating your workers, etc. So I think these categories are very important in order to understand how uneven development is under capitalist conditions is functioning. The changing geopolitical situation. You were asking about the BRICS. Well, the BRICS, or the BRICS Plus, as they should be called now, they're not united by a common ideology, right? They have even partners that are very or integrated in the BRICS are member states that have even conflicting interests, like China and India. So I don't really see that the BRICS are a powerful, united body in the future. But what they do represent is the kind of changing geopolitical situations that probably the US dominance and hegemony that was very typical for the last 30 years, that's going to end. Just if we look at the economic and political influence that these countries exercise. But I don't see the BRICS as a really coherent organization that will be able to exercise a lot of power due to its inner frictions. And specter of redistribution, I like that sentence. Is that happening in Russia? I would say it's not really happening right now, at least to a very limited degree. But of course, a Green Deal would be a very important alternative for Russia. But I think if we are, in order to have a more sustainable society, and we really need to think about industrializing other parts of the world, especially Africa, Latin America. All these countries, all these regions have to be able to produce industrial goods. But it would be very important to think about which kind of industrial products we actually need and what kind of industrial sectors and we should develop and in a sustainable way, right? In order to avoid, again, a growth race and avoid resource extraction that is based on consumption in a way that is not sustainable. So I think, yes, a Green New Deal would be something, a very interesting alternative in Russia, and Russia still has a broad industry, so that could be actually enacted a lot easier. But this demands, like I said in the beginning, this demands planning, and this demands also the alternatives to what kind of money can will Russia be able to spend if the country is so much dependent on the resource export. How is the country going to finance schools? How is the country going to finance healthcare, for example? This is something very difficult once resource extraction is going to stop.